You could feel the war getting ready in the sky that night. The way the clouds moved aside and came back, and the way the stars looked, a million of them swimming between the clouds like the enemy discs, and the feeling that the sky might fall upon the city and turn it into chalk dust, and the moon go up in red fire, that was how the night felt. Montag walked from the subway with the money in his pocket. He had visited the bank, which was open all night every night with robot tellers in attendance. And as he walked, he listened to the seashell radio in one ear. We have mobilized 1,000,000 men. Quick victory is ours if the war comes. Music flooded over the voice quickly, and it was gone. 10,000,000 men mobilized. Faber's voice whispered in his other ear. But say 1,000,000. It's happier. Faber? Yes? I'm not thinking. I'm just doing like I'm told, like always. You said get the money and I got it. I didn't really think of it myself. When do I start working things out on my own? You started already, by saying what you just said. You'll have to take me on faith. I took the others on faith. Yes, and look where we're headed. You'll have to travel blind for a while. Here's my arm to hold on to. I don't want to change sides and just be told what to do. There's no reason to change if I do that. You're wise already. Montag felt his feet moving on him on the sidewalk toward his house. Keep talking. Would you like me to read? I'll read so you can remember. I go to bed only 5 hours a night. Nothing to do, so if you like, I'll read you to sleep nights. They say you retain knowledge even when you're sleeping, if someone whispers it in your ear. Yes, here. Far away across town in the night, the faintest whisper of a turned page, the book of Job. The moon rose in the sky as Montag walked, his lips moving just a trifle. He was eating a light supper at 9 in the evening when the front door cried out in the hall and Mildred ran from the parlor like a native fleeing an eruption of Vesuvius. Mrs. Phelps and Mrs. Bowles came through the front door and vanished into the volcano's mouth with martinis in their hands. Montag stopped eating. They were like a monstrous crystal chandelier tinkling in 1,000 chimes. He saw their Cheshire cat smiles burning through the walls of the house, and now they were screaming at each other above the din. Montag found himself at the parlor door with his food still in his mouth. Doesn't everyone look nice? Nice. You look fine, Millie. Fine. Everyone looks swell. Swell. Montag stood watching them. Patience, whispered Faber. I shouldn't be here, whispered Montag, almost to himself. I should be on my way back to you with the money. Tomorrow's time enough. Careful. Isn't this show wonderful? Cried Mildred. Wonderful. On one wall a woman smiled and drank orange juice simultaneously. How does she do both at once? Thought Montag insanely. In the other walls, an X-ray of the same woman revealed the contracting journey of the refreshing beverage on its way to her delighted stomach. Abruptly, the room took off on a rocket flight into the clouds. It plunged into a lime-green sea where the blue fish ate red and yellow fish. A minute later, 3 white cartoon clowns chopped off each other's limbs to the accompaniment of immense incoming tides of laughter. 2 minutes more, and the room whipped out of town to the jet cars wildly circling an arena, bashing and backing up and bashing each other again. Montag was a number of bodies fly in the air. Saw a number of bodies fly in the air. Millie, did you see that? I saw it. I saw it. Montag reached inside the parlor wall and pulled the main switch. The images drained away as if the water had been let from a gigantic crystal bowl of hysterical fish. The 3 women turned slowly and looked with unconcealed irritation, and then dislike at Montag. When do you suppose the war will start? He said. I notice your husbands aren't here tonight. Oh, they come and go, said Mrs. Phelps. In again and out again, Finnegan. The army called Pete yesterday. He'll be back next week. The army said so. Quick war. 48 hours, they said. And everyone home. That's what the army said. Quick war. Pete was called yesterday, and they said he'd be back next week. Quick. The 3 women fidgeted and looked nervously at the empty mud-colored walls. I'm not worried, said Mrs. Phelps. I'll let Pete do all the worrying. She giggled. I'll let old Pete do all the worrying, not me. I'm not worried. Yes, said Millie. Let old Pete do the worrying. It's always someone else's husband dies, they say. I've heard that, too. I've never known any dead man killed in war. Killed jumping off buildings, yes, like Gloria's husband last week, but from wars? No. Not from wars, said Mrs. Phelps. Anyway, Pete and I always said, no tears, nothing like that. It's our 3rd marriage, each, and we're independent. Be independent, we always said. He said, if I get killed off, you just go right ahead and don't cry, but get married again, and don't think of me. That reminds me, said Mildred. Did you see that Clara Dove 5-minute romance last night on your wall? Well, it was all about this woman who... Montag said nothing but stood looking at the women's faces as he had once looked at the faces of saints in a strange church he entered when he was a child. The faces of those enameled creatures meant nothing to him, though he talked to them and stood in that church for a long time, trying to be of that religion, trying to know what that religion was, trying to get enough of raw incense and special dust of the place into his lungs, and thus into his blood, to feel touched and concerned by the meaning of the colorful men and women with the porcelain eyes and the blood-ruby lips. But there was nothing. It was a stroll through another store, and his currency strange and unusable there, and his passion cold, even when he touched the wood and plaster and clay. So it was now in his own parlor, with these women twisting in their chairs under his gaze, lighting cigarettes, blowing smoke, touching their sun-fired hair, and examining their blazing fingernails as if they had caught fire from his look. Their faces grew haunted with silence. They leaned forward at the sound of Montag swallowing his final bite of food. They listened to his feverish breathing. The 3 empty walls of the room were like the pale brows of sleeping giants now, empty of dreams. Montag felt that if you touched these 3 staring brows, you would feel a fine salt sweat on your fingertips. The perspiration gathered with the silence, and the sub-audible trembling around and about, and in the women who were burning with tension. Any moment they might hiss a long, sputtering hiss and explode. Montag moved his lips. "Let's talk." The women jerked and stared. "How are your children, Mrs. Phelps?" he asked. "You know I haven't any." "No one in his right mind, the good Lord knows, would have children," said Mrs. Phelps, not quite sure why she was angry with this man. "I wouldn't say that," said Mrs. Bowles. "I've had 2 children by cesarean section." "No use going through all that agony for a baby. The world must reproduce, you know. The race must go on. Besides, they sometimes look just like you, and that's nice. 2 cesareans turn the trick. Yes, sir. Oh, my doctor said cesareans aren't necessary. You've got the hips for it. Everything's normal. But I insisted. "Cesareans or not, children are ruinous. You're out of your mind," said Mrs. Phelps. "I plunk the children in school 9 days out of 10. I put up with them when they come home 3 days a month. It's not bad at all. You have them into the parlor and turn the switch. It's like washing clothes. Snuff laundry in and slam the lid." Mrs. Bowles tittered. "They'd just as soon kick as kiss me. Thank God I can kick back." The women showed their tongues, laughing. Mildred sat a moment, and then, seeing that Montag was still in the doorway, clapped her hands. "Let's talk politics, to please Guy." "Sounds fine," said Mrs. Bowles. "I voted last election, same as everyone, and I laid it on the line for President Noble. I think he's one of the nicest-looking men ever become president." "Oh, but the man they ran against him. He wasn't much, was he? Kind of small and homely. And he didn't shave too close or comb his hair very well. What possessed the outs to run him? You just don't go running a short little man like that against a tall man. Besides," he mumbled, "half the time I couldn't hear a word he said, and the words I did hear I didn't understand. Fat, too, and didn't dress to hide it. No wonder the landslide was for Winston Noble. Even their names helped. Compare Winston Noble to Hubert Hoag, or for 10 seconds, and you can almost figure the results." "Damn it!" cried Montag. "What do you know about Hoag and Noble?" "Why, they were right in that parlor wall not 6 months ago. One was always picking his nose. It drove me wild." "Well, Mr. Montag," said Mr. Phelps, "do you want us to vote for a man like that?" Mildred beamed. "You just run away from the door, Guy, and you don't make us nervous." But Montag was gone and back in a moment with a book in his hand. "Guy? Damn it all, damn it all, damn it. What have you got there? Isn't that a book? I thought that was all special training these days was done by film." Mrs. Phelps blinked. "You reading up on fireman theory?" "Theory hell," said Montag. "It's poetry." "Montag," a whisper. "Leave me alone." Montag felt himself turning into a great circling roar and buzz and hum. "Montag, hold on, don't... Did you hear them? Did you hear these monsters talking about monsters? Oh, God, the way they jabber about people and their own children and themselves, and the way they talk about their husbands, and the way they talk about war. Damn it, I stand here and I can't believe it." "I didn't say a single word about any war, I'll have you know," said Mrs. Phelps. "As for poetry, I hate it," said Mrs. Bowles. "Have you ever heard any?" "Montag?" Faber's voice scraped away at him. "You'll ruin everything. Shut up, you fool." All 3 women were on their feet. "Sit down." They sat. "I'm going home," quavered Mrs. Bowles. Montag, please, in the name of God, what are you up to?" pleaded Faber. "Why don't you just read us one of those poems from your little book?" Mrs. Phelps nodded. "I think that'd be very interesting." "It's not right," wailed Mrs. Bowles. "We can't do that." "Well, look at Mr. Montag. He wants to. I know he does. And if we listen nice, Mr. Montag will be happy, and then maybe we can go on and do something else. She glanced nervously at the long emptiness of the walls enclosing them. Montag, go through with this, and I'll cut off. I'll leave. The beetle jabbed in his ear. What good is this? What'll you prove? Scare hell out of him, that's what. Scare the living daylights out. Mildred looked at the empty air. Now, Guy, just who are you talking to? A silver needle pierced his brain. Montag, listen. Only one way out. Play it as a joke. Cover up. Pretend. You aren't mad at all. Then walk to your wall incinerator and throw the book in. Mildred had already anticipated this in a quavery voice. Ladies, once a year every fireman's allowed to bring one book home, from the old days, to show his family how silly it all was, how nervous that sort of thing can make you, how crazy. Guy's surprise tonight is to read you one sample to show you how mixed up things were, so none of us will ever have to bother our little old heads about that junk again. Isn't that right, darling? He crushed the book in his fists. Say yes. His mouth moved like Faber's. Yes. Mildred snatched the book with a laugh. Here, read this one. No, I take it back. Here's that real funny one you read out loud today. Ladies, you won't understand a word. It goes umpty-tumpty-ump. Go ahead, Guy. That page, dear. He looked at the open page. A fly stirred its wings softly in his ear. Read. What's the title, dear? Dover Beach. His mouth was numb. Now read in a nice, clear voice, and go slow. The room was blazing hot. He was all fire. He was all coldness. They sat in the middle of an empty desert, with 3 chairs and him standing, swaying, and him waiting for Mrs. Phelps to stop straightening her dress, and him and Mrs. Bowles to take her fingers away from her hair. Then he began to read in a low, stumbling voice that grew firmer as he progressed from line to line, and his voice went out across the desert, into the whiteness, and around the 3 sitting women there in the great hot emptiness. The sea of faith was once, too, at the full and round earth's shore, lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled, but now I only hear its melancholy, long, withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. The chairs creaked under the 3 women. Montag finished it out. Ah, love, let us be true to one another, for the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy nor love nor light, nor certitude nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. Mrs. Phelps was crying. The others in the middle of the desert watched her crying grow very loud as her face squeezed itself out of shape. They sat not touching her, bewildered with her display. She sobbed uncontrollably. Montag himself was stunned and shaken. Shh, shh, said Mildred. You're all right, Clara. Now, Clara, snap out of it. Clara, what's wrong? I, sobbed Mrs. Phelps. Don't know, I just don't know. Oh. Mrs. Bowles stood up and glared at Montag. You see, I knew it. That's what I wanted to prove. I knew it would happen. I've always said poetry and tears. Poetry and suicide and crying and awful feelings. Poetry and sickness. All that mush. Now I've had it proved to me. You're nasty, Mr. Montag. You're nasty. Faber said, Now. Montag felt himself turn and walk into the wall slot and drop the book in through the brass notch to the waiting flames. Silly words, silly awful hurting words, said Mrs. Bowles. Why do people want to hurt people? Not enough hurt in the world. You gotta tease people with stuff like that. Clara now, Clara, begged Mildred, pulling her arm. Come on, let's be cheery. You turn the family on now. Go ahead, let's laugh and be happy now. Stop crying, we'll have a party. No, said Mrs. Bowles, I'm trotting right straight home. You want to visit my house and my family? Well and good. But I won't come in this fireman's crazy house again in my lifetime. Go home. Montag fixed his eyes upon her, quietly. Go home and think of your first husband, divorced, and your second husband killed in a jet, and your third husband blowing his brains out. Go home and think of the dozen abortions you've had. Go home and think of that and your damn cesarean sections too, and your children who ate your guts. Go home and think how it all happened, and what did you ever do to stop it? Go home, he yelled, before I knock you down and kick you out the door. Doors slammed and the house was empty. Montag stood alone in the winter weather with the parlor walls the color of dirty snow. In the bathroom, water ran. He heard Mildred shake the sleeping tablets into her hand. Fool, Montag. Fool. Oh, God, you silly fool. Shut up. He pulled the green bullet from his ear and jammed it into his pocket. It sizzled faintly. Fool. He searched the house and found the books where Mildred had stacked them behind the refrigerator. Some were missing, and he knew that she had started on her own slow process of dispersing the dynamite in her house stick by stick. But he was not angry now, only exhausted and bewildered with himself. He carried the books into the backyard and hid them in the bushes near the alley fence. For tonight only, he thought, in case she decides to do any more burning. He went back through the house. "Mildred?" he called at the door of the darkened bedroom. There was no sound. Outside, crossing the lawn on his way to work, he tried not to see how completely dark and deserted Clarice McClellan's house was. On the way downtown, he was so completely alone with his terrible error that he felt the necessity for the strange warmness and goodness that came from a familiar and gentle voice speaking in the night. Already in a short few hours it seemed that he had known Faber a lifetime. Now that he knew that he was two people, that he was, above all, Montag, who knew nothing, who did not even know himself a fool, but only suspected it. And he knew that he was also the old man who talked to him as the train was sucked from one end of this night city to the other on one long, sickening gasp of motion. In the days to follow, and in the nights when there was no moon, and in the nights when there was a very bright moon shining on the earth, the old man would go on with his talking, and this talking, drop by drop, stone by stone, flake by flake. His mind would well over at last, and he would not be Montag any more. This would be the old man told him, assured him, promised him. He would be Montag plus Faber, fire plus water, and then one day, after everything had mixed and simmered and worked away in silence, there would be neither fire nor water, but wine, one of the two separate and opposite things, a third. And one day he would look back upon the fool and know the fool. Even now he could feel the start of the long journey, the leave-taking, the going away, from the self he had been. It was good listening to the beetle hum, the sleepy mosquito buzz, and delicate filigree murmur of the old man's voice, at first scolding him, then consoling him in an hour of night, as he emerged from the streaming subway toward the firehouse world. Pity, Montag, pity. Don't haggle and nag them. You were so recently of them yourself. They're so confident that they will run on forever, but they won't run on. They don't know that this is all one huge, big, blazing meteor that makes a pretty fire in space, but that someday it'll have to hit. They only see the blaze, the pretty fire, as you saw it.